One human word silenced the Galactic Council and filled the chamber with fear. No. The moment the door sealed behind me, I knew they had already decided. I could feel it in the way the chamber breathed. Not metaphorically. The room actually breathed. The walls of the conclave of Aetheris were alive in some ancient, biological sense that no human scientist had fully explained yet. They expanded and contracted in a slow, rhythmic pulse, like the ribs of something enormous that had been sleeping for centuries and had only just noticed I was standing inside it. My name is Kale Morrow. I am 39 years old. I am the ambassador of Earth, and 3 minutes ago I was handed a document that would freeze the future of every human being alive. The chamber was shaped like the inside of a shell, spiraling upward into a ceiling so high it was lost in amber haze. 41 podiums curved around the central platform in a perfect arc, each one carved from the native stone of a different world. They gleamed under the bioluminescent light strips that lined the walls, and behind each podium stood a representative of a species that had been navigating the stars while my ancestors were still drawing on cave walls. I had read every briefing. I had studied every species, every diplomatic custom, every recorded moment from every council session that had ever been made available to humans. I knew that the Vorthon delegate to my left secreted a mild paralytic through its skin when startled, and that I should not make sudden movements near it. I knew that the Solan hegemony's representative communicated partially through bioluminescent patterns along her collar bones, and that the flicker she was currently displaying translated roughly to, "This will be quick." I knew that the presiding Archon, who stood at the apex of the arc on a raised dais of black glass, had held her position for longer than the entire recorded history of human civilization. I knew all of it, and none of it prepared me for the weight of actually being here. My podium was new. I could smell it. Fresh-cut metal alloy, the kind that had a faint sweetness to it before it oxidized. It had been installed 72 hours ago, specifically for this session, specifically for me. It was slightly shorter than the others, which the Council's protocol office had assured my team was a logistical matter, not a symbolic one. I did not believe them, but I had smiled and nodded and said nothing. That was the last time I smiled in this chamber. The charge against humanity, if you could call it that, was wrapped in the language of progress and shared welfare. The Restricted Corridor Resolution, as it was formally titled, would designate all human-occupied space as a zone of managed development. Our faster-than-light routes would require council licensing. Our colony ships would need approval from a committee of species who had never met a human in person. Our resource extraction, our trade agreements, our communication relays, all of it would pass through a bureaucratic layer controlled entirely by civilizations who had spent the last century watching us expand and deciding, quietly among themselves, that we were moving too fast. Too fast for whom? I had asked my briefing officer on the shuttle ride here. She had looked at me the way people look at someone who asks a question that does not have a comfortable answer. The session opened without ceremony. The Archon did not welcome me. She acknowledged my presence with a single tilt of her head, the same gesture she used when nodding that a new document had been entered into the record. I was, to her and to this room, a formality. She spoke in High Galactic, and the translator bead in my collar rendered it into English with a slight half-second delay that I had spent 3 weeks training myself not to react to. The conclave of Aetheris convenes in its 4,317th session, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the room the way water fills a container, touching every surface at once. The resolution before us concerns the developmental classification of the Sol system and its associated expansion corridors. The Council has reviewed all submitted documentation. Deliberation is complete. We proceed to the accord of voices. That was it. No debate. No presentation of counterarguments. No invitation for me to speak. The deliberation, she had said, was complete. That deliberation had happened in rooms I was not allowed to enter, in a language I was not officially permitted to access, between species who had made their decision before I landed. The accord of voices was the Council's oldest tradition. Every decision required unanimity, not majority vote, not consensus with abstentions. Every voice joined as one. It was described in Council literature as the highest expression of civilized cooperation. It was described in my private notes as the most elegant system of enforced agreement ever devised by intelligent life. The Archon began at the far left of the arc. The Gareth Collective's delegate raised one of its four hands. "My voice is the Council's voice," it said. The next delegate, "My voice is the Council's voice." And the next and the next. I watched them, not with anger, with something closer to grief, because some of them were brilliant. Some of them represented species that had composed music that made humans weep, that had built structures visible from orbit, that had developed medicines that cured diseases we did not even have names for yet. And every single one of them was standing at their beautiful, ancient podium and giving away their voice without a flicker of hesitation. 38 voices joined. 39. 40. The Archon turned to me. The living walls pulsed once slowly, as if the chamber itself was exhaling. "The voice of the soul system," she said. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the bioluminescent strips. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear, from somewhere far above in the amber haze of the ceiling, a sound like distant wind. I had rehearsed a speech. It was a good speech, measured, diplomatic, full of carefully chosen phrases that acknowledged the Council's authority while respectfully requesting a review period. My briefing officer had approved it. The Foreign Relations Board had approved it. 2 of Earth's former ambassadors had called it exactly the right tone. I opened my mouth, and I did not say any of it. What came out was one word, one syllable, quiet, flat, not shouted, not declared, not performed, just spoken the way you might say it to someone who offered you something you did not want. No. The chamber stopped breathing. I do not mean that as a figure of speech. The walls, which had been pulsing with that slow, constant rhythm since the moment I arrived, went completely still. The bioluminescent strips flickered. Somewhere to my right, the Vorthon delegate made a sound that my translator bead rendered only as error, no linguistic equivalent found. The Solon hegemony's representative, whose collar bones had been flashing smoothly and confidently all session, went dark. The Archon's ceremonial staff, a long rod of braided crystalline material that she had held without trembling for longer than humans had been writing things down, slipped from her fingers and struck the black glass dais with a sound like a bell being hit by another bell. It rolled to the edge and stopped. Nobody moved to pick it up. I stood at my short, new, sweet-smelling podium and I waited. The translator bead in my collar had gone silent for exactly 3 seconds. I know because I counted. 1, 2, 3. And then it came back online with a soft chime, the way a computer restarts after an unexpected shutdown, and I heard it begin cycling through languages, trying to find a cultural container for what I had just said. It did not find one. I learned later, from a linguistics specialist on the Council's own staff, that the bead had attempted 17 different language matrices before flagging the word as an untranslatable anomaly. Not because the concept of refusal was entirely unknown in galactic civilization. Some species had words that meant reluctance, or hesitation, or deferral, or a request for more time. But a clean, unqualified, non-negotiable refusal directed at a body of authority, with no accompanying apology, no suggestion of compromise, and no indication that the speaker intended to walk it back. That specific shape of the word. It did not exist in High Galactic. It did not exist in any of the Council's 41 official languages. They had never needed it, not once, not in 5,000 years. I stood at my podium and I watched the chamber try to process what had just happened, and I will tell you honestly that my hands were shaking. Not visibly. I had them flat on the edge of the podium, pressing down hard enough that the cool metal grounded me, gave me something to feel besides the enormity of 40 pairs of alien eyes trying to understand what I was. The Archon recovered first. That did not surprise me. She had not held her position for 5,000 years by being easily rattled. She straightened, and she looked at me with an expression that I did not have a name for because it was not quite any emotion I had ever seen on a human face. It was somewhere between calculation and something very old, something that had seen civilizations rise and collapse and had learned to measure things in geological time. Ambassador Morrow, she said. Her voice had not changed. That steadiness was its own kind of power. The accord of voices requires the joined affirmation of all seated representatives. We will allow that the translator systems may have encountered a technical difficulty. Please restate your voice for the record. She was giving me an exit. A clean, face-saving, officially logged exit. All I had to do was claim a malfunction. The bead had already flagged an anomaly. It would be entirely believable. I could walk it back in the next 30 seconds and the session would continue and I would go home. I thought about my daughter. Her name is Nora. She is 11 years old and she wants to be a pilot. Not a shuttle pilot, not a transport operator, a deep space pilot. She has a map of the expansion corridors on her bedroom wall, and she traces the routes with her finger and asks me questions about the planets at the ends of those lines. What are the atmospheres like? What do the sunrises look like with two suns instead of one? Whether the ice on certain moons is the kind you could stand on. Under the restricted corridor resolution, those routes would require council licensing by the time Nora was old enough to fly them. The committee that issued those licenses would not include a single human member for the first 50 years of the resolution's operation. I had read that part of the document 4 times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. I had understood it correctly. There was no technical difficulty, I said. My voice is not the council's voice. The Sol system does not join this accord. The chamber did not go quiet this time, because it was already quiet. Instead, it went through a series of sounds I had no reference for. The Gareth Collective's delegate produced a low, resonant hum that made the air vibrate near my chest. 2 representatives from a species called the Marath, who shared a podium because they were a bonded pair, and their civilization counted bonded pairs as single diplomatic units, pressed against each other and began speaking in overlapping whispers so fast that my bead gave up translating entirely and simply displayed a spinning indicator. The Vreth Collective's delegate, a tall narrow being wrapped in pale layered fabric, made a sound that my bead rendered after a long pause as a frequency associated with the perception of structural collapse. And then it fell forward and had to be caught by the delegate standing next to it. It had fainted. An alien diplomat had fainted. In 5,000 years of council history, I was reasonably confident that had never happened before either. The Archon raised one hand and the chamber settled into a tense, electric stillness. Not the easy quiet of before, when everyone was simply waiting for the formality to complete. This was a held-breath stillness, the kind that happens when something is broken and nobody wants to be the first to acknowledge how badly. "Call recess," she said, and it was the first time I heard anything in her voice besides composure. It was very small, that other thing, but I heard it. "The council will reconvene in 2 hours." The representatives filed out through their respective exits. They did not look at me, not one of them. I noticed it specifically because 40 pairs of eyes had been on me moments ago, and now I was standing in an emptying room being studiously, carefully, deliberately not looked at. The only exception was the Solon hegemony's representative. She paused at the edge of the arc as the others moved past her, and she turned and looked at me for a long moment. The bioluminescent patterns on her collarbones were doing something slow and complex. My bead translated it in pieces, uncertain, witnessing, something it rendered only as the feeling of watching a moment that will be told later. Then she followed the others out. I sat down on the floor behind my podium. There were no chairs on the human platform. The Council's protocol office had not thought to include one. I sat on the floor of an alien chamber that was 5,000 years old, and I put my face in my hands for about 45 seconds, and I let myself feel how frightening this was. I gave myself exactly 45 seconds, because I had learned that if you do not let fear out in controlled amounts, it finds its own way out at the worst possible moment. Then I put my hands back on my knees and I breathed, and I looked up at the amber haze where the ceiling disappeared, and I thought about what came next. A figure appeared at the edge of the chamber, small, young by the body language, wearing the pale gray uniform of a junior council aide. He was from the Solan hegemony. I could tell by the faint luminescent quality of his skin, though it was much less pronounced than in the older representative. He stopped several meters from me and stood very still, the way prey animals stand still when they are not sure what the larger creature is going to do. "Ambassador Morrow," he said. His English was careful and slightly formal, the kind learned from text rather than conversation. "I was asked to inform you that refreshments will be provided during the recess." "Thank you," I said. He did not leave. His hands moved slightly at his sides, and I recognized the gesture. Someone who wants to say something and is trying to decide if it is safe. "Go ahead," I said. He looked at the exits, all of them empty now. Then he looked at me. "Do you understand," he said quietly, "what the last species was that refused the council?" "I do," I said. "They are not here anymore." "I know," I said. "I read about the Kareth." Something moved across his face at the name. Surprise, maybe, or something heavier than surprise. "Most humans do not know that name," he said. "Most humans were not given access to the restricted archive 3 days before a vote that determines their civilization's future," I said. I had motivation to read carefully. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very softly, "You are not what we expected." I looked at him. He was young, this aide, young enough that the universe still surprised him. I found that I liked him for it. "What did you expect?" I asked. "Compliance," he said, "or at least the performance of it." I nodded slowly. "Everyone expected that," I said. "That's the problem with expecting it. You stop preparing for anything else." He left after that, walking quickly, and I sat alone in the breathing chamber and waited and thought, and remembered everything I had read about the Kareth. 2 hours became 9. I know because I counted them, and because the bioluminescent strips along the walls cycled through 3 full color shifts, which a footnote in my briefing documents had mentioned happened every 3 hours as part of the chamber's environmental regulation system. I watched all 3 cycles. I had nothing else to do. They had not given me access to a communication terminal. That was not an accident. The refreshments they sent were a gray paste in a sealed container with a pull tab, the galactic equivalent of something you eat because you need to and not because you want to. I ate it. I was not going to perform a hunger protest. That was not the kind of message I wanted to send. I ate the paste and I drank the water and I sat on the floor and I read. My personal data tablet had a partial connection to the Council's open archive. Partial, meaning not the sealed sections, not the classified deliberation records, not the private communications. But the open archive was vast, and I had not yet come close to its edges. I searched for the Kareth. What I found was not what the restricted archive had shown me in fragments. The open archive's version of the Kareth was brief, dignified, and almost entirely wrong. It described them as a civilization of the Middle Period, notable for their contributions to subspace navigation theory, who had faced internal political instability, and gradually receded from galactic participation over a period of roughly 2 centuries. The entry was 6 paragraphs. It had the quality of something written by someone who knew exactly what they were leaving out. I searched harder, cross-references, footnotes, the bibliographic trails that careful historians leave even when they are trying not to. And in those margins, in the gaps between official entries, I found the shape of what had actually happened. The Karath had said no. Not in an open chamber, not dramatically, not the way I had. They had said no in smaller ways first. They had declined a resource-sharing agreement. They had refused a communications treaty that would have given the Council monitoring access to their internal networks. They had pushed back, item by item, year by year, on a slow accumulation of accords that each one individually seemed manageable, but together added up to something the Karath had finally recognized as a cage. The Council had not declared anything against them. That was the precise, careful, brilliant part of it. There had been no formal action, no resolution, no vote, just a quiet, coordinated, entirely deniable shift. Trade agreements expired and were not renewed. Shipping lanes that ran through Karath space were rerouted for efficiency reasons. Species that had been Karath allies found reasons to reduce diplomatic contact. The Council's Development Fund, which had supported 17 Karath infrastructure projects, completed those projects and then found other priorities. It had taken 180 years. 180 years of a civilization being slowly turned off, switch by switch, until one day there were not enough ships moving through Karath space to sustain a starfaring economy, and one day after that there were not enough resources moving to sustain the colonies, and one day after that the colonies began to contract, and it continued, compressing and compressing, until the Karath existed only on their home world, and then only in part of their home world. And the entry in the Galactic Archive described it as internal political instability and gradual receding. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. I was something more focused than angry. Anger is hot and it burns fast and it makes you loud. What I felt was cold and precise and very, very steady. Because what the Karath's history told me was not that resistance was impossible. The Karath had resisted for 180 years with the resources of a single star system against the combined weight of galactic civilization. What it told me was that I was not fighting in the wrong direction. I was fighting in the wrong time frame. They were thinking in years. I needed them to think in generations. The Council reconvened at the 9th hour. They came back into the chamber changed in a way I could not precisely describe. Before, they had moved with the easy confidence of people completing a task they had already finished in their minds. Now there was something tighter in the way they took their places, something careful, the way people move when the floor has recently proven unreliable. The Archon stood at her dais. Someone had picked up her staff and returned it. The Council has prepared a revised text, she said. The revised resolution offers modified terms. An aide distributed documents to each podium. One was placed on mine. I opened it. It was nearly identical to the original. The language was softer. Several of the specific restrictions were phrased as guidelines rather than requirements. There was a new clause promising a human advisory seat on the licensing committee within 20 years. A single advisory seat, non-voting. I read every word carefully, then I set it down. With respect, I said, this is the same resolution with different punctuation. Several delegates shifted. The Solon representative's collar bones flickered. The framework remains consistent, the Archon said. The modifications address the primary concerns raised by. I did not raise concerns, I said. I declined. Those are different things. Raising concerns means I am negotiating terms. Declining means I do not accept the premise. I do not accept the premise that humanity's expansion should be licensed by a body we have no meaningful representation in. You have a seat, said the Garath delegate. Its voice through my translator was a deep rumble, the sound of something very large and very old speaking. I have a podium, I said. That is not the same thing. I have been allowed to stand in this room and witness a decision that was made before I arrived. That is not participation. That is observation. Silence again, but a different silence than before. Before, the silence had been shock. This was the silence of 41 species doing a kind of mathematics they had not expected to need. I opened the data files I had prepared on my tablet and connected them to the chamber's display system. This was within my diplomatic rights. I had checked 3 times. A projection appeared above the central platform. Simple graphs, clean lines, nothing theatrical. This is humanity's population growth curve over the last 200 years, I said. This line is our industrial output. This one is the rate at which we commission new colony ships. This one is the average time between a human technological innovation and its implementation at scale. I let them look. Every one of these lines is accelerating, I said. Not linearly. The rate of acceleration is itself accelerating. This is not a projection or an estimate. This is recorded history. I advanced to the next display. This is what the restricted corridor resolution does to those lines at year 10, at year 25, at year 60. The lines bent, constrained, flattened. And this is the pressure that builds inside a civilization when its natural expansion rate is forcibly reduced. I advanced again. This is what every similar containment attempt has produced in human history. We have done this to ourselves many times. We have blockaded each other, embargoed each other, sanctioned each other. Here is what the data shows. In every single case without exception, the contained population found a new way through, around, or past the barrier within 2 to 3 generations. And in every single case, the barrier made them more motivated, more unified, and more technically innovative than they had been before the containment began. I looked up at the Archon. I am not making a threat, I said clearly. I am showing you mathematics. You are not looking at a civilization you can slow down. You are looking at a civilization that responds to resistance by accelerating. If you pass this resolution, you will not contain humanity. You will compress us. And in 60 years, when the pressure is released, because it will be released, one way or another, you will have made us faster and harder and much less interested in the kind of diplomatic patience I am showing you right now. The chamber was very still. You are not restricting humanity, I said. You are lighting a very long fuse. I closed the display. I folded my hands on the podium. I waited. The Archon looked at me for a long time, and then she said something I had not expected. Call recess, she said, 30 hours. I want to tell you what 30 hours inside the conclave of Aetheris feels like when you are the only human in the building. It is very quiet, not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight, the kind that presses on your shoulders and sits at the base of your skull and reminds you, every few minutes, that you are approximately 27 light years from the nearest other human being, and you have just told the governing body of galactic civilization that it cannot do what it has decided to do. They gave me a room. It was small and it had the same slow pulse in the walls as the chamber, which I had expected would make it hard to sleep. But actually, I found it oddly comforting, like sleeping near something breathing. There was a sleep surface that was not quite a bed but was not quite not a bed either, and I lay on it and stared at the ceiling and went through everything I had said, and everything I had not said, and everything I should have said differently, and eventually I decided that I had said what needed to be said, and that continuing to review it was not productive. I slept for 4 hours, then I woke up and worked. At hour 7, a message came through my tablet, not from Earth, from inside the building. It was a request for a private meeting from the delegate of the Garath Collective. No explanation, No context, just the request and a proposed time. I accepted. He came to my room at hour 9. I had not been entirely sure what to expect from a Gareth in a non-formal setting, having only seen them at their podium and in the briefing documents, which described them as ancient, patient, and nearly impossible to read. In person, in a small room, he was large in a way that the chamber had not quite conveyed. His four-limbed frame folding itself carefully into a position that was not sitting, but was the closest available approximation. He said nothing for a moment. I had read that the Gareth considered the opening of a conversation to be a significant gesture and did not rush it. "Ambassador Morrow," he said finally, "I have a question that is not part of the formal proceedings." "Ask it," I said. "Your species has been spacefaring for less than 2 of our standard centuries," he said. "You are, by any measure, very new, and yet you sat in our chamber today and you refused us, and you did not appear to believe, even for a moment, that we might simply remove you." "I considered the possibility," I said. "And yet you proceeded." "Yes." "Why?" he said, and it was a genuine question, not a challenge, not a test. He actually wanted to know. I thought about how to answer it. "Do you know what humans were before we had tools?" I said. "Before we had weapons or fire or any of the things we built." He waited. "We were prey," I said, "for a very long time. There were things on our planet that were faster than us, stronger than us, better equipped to survive than us by almost every physical measure. We should not have made it. By the math of it, we should have been gone before we ever had the chance to build anything." He was listening with the quality of something that did not need to process quickly, because it had all the time it needed. "The reason we survived," I said, "is complicated and researchers still argue about parts of it. But one of the things we learned very early, so early it is built into the structure of how we think, is that you cannot wait for the threat to become survivable. By the time a threat is survivable, it has already reduced you. You have to move toward it before you are ready. That is not bravery in the way you might define the word. It is a kind of practical calculation. If we wait, we definitely lose. If we move, we might not." The Gareth was quiet for a long time. "That is," he said, "a very uncomfortable way to live." "Yes," I agreed. "And you have never lost that quality," he said. "We have tried," I said. "Periodically we convince ourselves we are civilized enough not to need it. Then something happens and it turns out we were wrong." He made a sound that was low and resonant, and my bead did not translate it. I think it might have been laughter. "I will not tell you how I am going to vote," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I understand. But I will tell you," he said, "that in 4,000 years of attending these sessions, I have never had a conversation like this one. And I am old enough that the things I have never experienced are very few." He left after that, and before the 30 hours were up, I had 5 more requests for private meetings. The Solon representative came. She did not speak very much, but she showed me the bioluminescent pattern that her briefing document said was reserved for acknowledging an equal, and that was worth more than a long speech. A delegate I had not expected, from a species called the Lethian who had not made eye contact with me in the chamber, arrived and sat across from me, and told me quietly that his civilization had wanted to refuse a trade accord 60 years ago and had not, and that what followed had cost them their deep space mining rights permanently. He did not say anything else. He did not ask anything. He had just wanted to say it to someone. The Vreth delegate, the one who had fainted, came with 2 aides who stood near the door looking nervous. He sat very straight and asked me to explain in detail how humans learn to refuse authority. Not the politics, not the philosophy, the mechanics. When do you learn it? Who teaches it? What does it feel like the first time? I told him about my grandmother who had raised me partly, and who had taught me the phrase respectfully, no as a complete sentence when I was 8 years old. I told him about the history I had studied, ordinary people across human history who had refused things that everyone around them said were inevitable. I told him about the particular feeling, which I did not have a precise word for, of saying something true in a room full of people expecting you to say something else. He recorded everything I said, every word. The aide he had brought to translate leaned over at one point and murmured to him, and he nodded and said to me, "We do not have a word for that feeling either. We may need to borrow yours." The final session convened at hour 31. I walked back into the chamber and the walls were breathing again. I stood at my short podium with its faint metallic smell, which had faded slightly in the days since it was installed, and I looked at the arc of 41 representatives, and I waited. The Archon stood at her dais. She did not look tired, but there was something different in the quality of her stillness, the stillness of someone who has reached a decision that surprised them. "The Council has deliberated," she said. "The restricted corridor resolution is withdrawn." 3 delegates stood up sharply. One said something fast and sharp in a language my bead recognized as a secondary dialect of the Garath, and translated as strong disagreement, context formal setting. 2 others turned toward the Archon with postures my bead flagged as indicating high emotional intensity. The Archon did not move. "In its place," she continued, "the Council will open a formal review of the Accord of Voices framework. This review will examine the provision requiring unanimous affirmation, its historical application, and its alignment with the Council's founding principles. This review will include consultation with all member species and all applicant species. It will conclude within 10 years, and its findings will be binding." The 3 standing delegates made more sounds. The Archon waited until they had finished. "A constitutional review," she said, "has been discussed in private session 7 times in the past 2,000 years. It has never proceeded because it has never had a catalyst. It has one now." I stood very still. "I will note for the record," the Archon said, and her voice did something almost imperceptible, a shift so slight that if I had not been listening with every part of my attention I would have missed it entirely, that the catalyst was Ambassador Kale Morrow, representing the Sol system. His intervention will be entered into the permanent record of this session. It will not be redacted and it will not be summarized. It will be entered in full, including the word that initiated it. She looked at me directly then. For the second time since I had arrived, she looked at me as a person rather than as a procedural element. "The Accord of Voices cannot proceed today," she said, "as it has not been completed. The session is therefore not formally closed. It is suspended, pending review." And then, with a precision that I think was entirely deliberate, she said, "All voices that are ready to join may do so. All voices that are not required to do so at this time." The chamber went through its sounds. The Garath delegate produced his low hum. The Lethian delegate who had visited me in my room looked at his podium and did not speak. The Vreth delegate stood very straight and said, in careful, precisely pronounced English, the word "noted." I pressed both hands flat on my podium, feeling the cool metal, and I said, "The Sol system thanks the Council for its consideration." I walked out of the chamber in the direction of the exit that led toward the transit bay. I did not run. I kept my pace steady and my shoulders level, and my face arranged in the careful, neutral expression that diplomatic training produces in people after enough repetition. I made it to the corridor outside the chamber. I found a section of wall between 2 structural columns where no one was currently standing, and I put my back against it and slid down until I was sitting on the floor again, knees up, head back, looking at the ceiling of an alien hallway. A cleaning drone rolled past. It was a small thing, disc-shaped, designed to collect atmospheric particulates from the floor surface. It was not a sophisticated machine. It had no more programming than it needed to do its job. It stopped next to me. I stared at it. It sat there for approximately 20 seconds. Then it resumed its path and rolled away. I do not know why it stopped. I thought about it for a long time afterward, and I never found an explanation that satisfied me. Maybe the sensor array detected that I was sitting where it needed to clean. Maybe something in my biosignature triggered a proximity protocol. Maybe 5,000 years of breathing walls and bioluminescent delegates had left this hallway with something stranger and more attentive than its designers intended. Or maybe the universe has a sense of timing. I sat on that floor for a while and let my hands shake and let my heart do what it needed to do. And then I got out my tablet and I started writing my report to Earth. Here is what I told them. I told them we did not win everything today. I want to be precise about that. The Council is old and large and has 5,000 years of institutional momentum, and one session, one word, does not redirect something that sighs cleanly or quickly. There will be friction in the years ahead. There will be species who are cool toward us for a generation because we complicated their certainty. There will be trade negotiations that take longer and licensing talks that are harder and diplomatic channels that are slower to warm than they would have been if I had said the thing everyone expected me to say. I told them that is the cost and we should pay it. Because here is what else I told them. The Vreth delegate sent me a message before I reached the transit bay. It was 3 sentences. It said, "We have been considering the word you used. We have no equivalent. We have agreed to borrow it from English, untranslated, and teach it to our young. We will teach them your pronunciation." The Lethian delegate's aide sent a message 2 hours later. It said that 17 member species had already filed formal voice reservations through a mechanism that had been in the Council's procedural code for 3,000 years and had never once been used. They had needed the word first. They had needed someone to say it first, clearly, in a room where everyone could witness it, so they could understand that it was a thing that could be said. I told Earth, we did not win a negotiation. We gave the galaxy a word it did not have. I told them, words are how civilizations change from the inside. I told them, Nora will have her roots. I landed at Earth Orbital Station 14 days later, and a representative from the Foreign Relations Board was waiting at the docking ring with the expression of someone who had spent 2 weeks trying to decide if they were proud or terrified, and had concluded the answer was both. "How are you?" he said. "Tired," I said, "and hungry. The food they gave me was not good." He almost smiled. "The Council is requesting a follow-up session in 3 months to discuss representation terms." "Good," I said. "They have conditions." "They always will," I said, "and we will talk about them at a table where our voice counts." He walked with me through the station, and I looked out the observation window at Earth below, blue and white and very beautiful, turning slowly the way it has always turned, patient and ancient in its own way, carrying 8 billion people who would wake up tomorrow and not know that anything had changed. And yet, somewhere in the Council's permanent archive, entered in full and marked unredactable, was the word. One word, one syllable. And in 17 languages across the galaxy, beings very different from me were learning to shape their mouths around a sound their species had never made before. They were learning to say it the way I had said it, quietly, without performance, without apology. Not as a beginning of a fight. As the beginning of a conversation between equals. That is how it starts, not with ships or treaties or the grand machinery of diplomacy. It starts with a single voice in a large room refusing to dissolve into the chorus, and the stillness that follows, and the slow, irreversible understanding that the stillness cannot simply be waited out. They had 5,000 years of unanimous agreement. We had one word. I am not worried about the math.